right, come on, guys, let's go.
Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Munro Live. I'm Kevin Hardy, and I'm here with Jordan Arocha. And today we're looking at the 2024 BMW i5 M60. So it is an M car. It has lots of things that are, indicative of an M car as well, like the very sweet fixed red brake calipers. But one thing we're gonna, this is a Hoist review. So as we kind of come under the vehicle, and this is something that Jordan and I were just discussing prior to shooting. It's very, very similar to the i7 that we looked at. And that's very indicative of many vehicles that we've seen in the past, specifically, BMWs. It makes sense, to use as much as you can and carry as much lessons learned through each vehicle itself. So, and Jordan, did you have a chance really to look through the i7 when Arm and I had a chance to take a peek at it last time?
Yeah, a little bit. Not nearly as in depth as I did here, but I suspect, likely as they did previously in like F10 generation. So 2 generations ago, actually, now with the 5 Series and the 7 Series, I would suspect that they've got a lot of architecture commonality, specifically as it relates to subframe, steering system, probably the general SORB package,
Yep.
right? How they're So essentially everything in the front end of the vehicle, as far as driving dynamics and structures are concerned, I would anticipate seeing a large overlap in terms of execution.
Yeah, and really that's kind of, from what I can remember, that's what we're seeing here. So, and realistically, a lot of, I would even say, carryover of strategies from that time frame as well, as they've adapted to a BEV platform. If you want to kind of come around and take a look through here. So you'll see, extruded aluminum crush trans bolted into a steel body, a extruded aluminum multi-cell front impact beam. One thing I do like as a performance vehicle, you're seeing here, these are injection molded clamshelled brake ducts, so bringing air directly to cool the brakes. And then on the outward side of this, you'll see, if you kind of look this way, Eric, you'll see another set of ducting to bring air from the fascia out and around to help clean the air as it moves around the vehicle for efficiency just in general. And then as we kind of move down, it's very hard to miss here the very large, SORB tusk, or small overlap rigid barrier tusk. So this helps the vehicle engage on that 25% barrier that it's a pretty crucial test, a third-party test that a lot of OEMs are striving to get good performance in that test, and frankly, most of the tests they do. One thing that Joe and I were kind of commenting on, though, is it's very interesting. You can see the mass and the depth of this casting here, or excuse me, probably forging, but then how much material is then taken out in these critical joints as it moves rearward in vehicle to get it to perform the way they'd like as it moves backwards. So, and one other kind of interesting note is you can see here, and I don't know if we talked about this with the i7, but these here, essentially there's a series of shear plates / aero covers for the cradle itself, but you can see the size of the bolts and kind of how it helps tie some of these monuments, the structure above it with these extrusions, and the casting of the cradle as it kind of goes up and over the lower cradle itself. But that's kind of indicative of what we've seen just in the past with a lot of BMWs. They're not opposed to essentially adding bracing where needed to essentially get good continuity and good chassis performance as far as ride and drive characteristics are concerned. As we move rearward, not a big surprise here as far as brakes or suspension. We have a forged aluminum virtual ball SLA setup here. And this is an active chassis setup as well. Frankly, in this segment, I don't think you'd expect anything less than what is here, One thing that's kind of interesting that Jordan and I were talking about here is essentially this front cradle itself. A very common strategy: 2 cast hemispheres welded together via extrusions running cross car. And then these extrusions that we have here on the leading edge of the battery pack itself. With this ramp feature here on the cradle and then the leading edge of the battery here as well. So, Jordan, what do you think from an impact perspective? Do you think we're trying to get the cradle up and over this lift here in an impact event? I think most of the cutouts we're seeing here are for tool head access.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah, it's tough to say. The ramp feature is certainly not by accident, right? When we look at these, almost always it's related to how this whole subframe unit is going to interface with the battery pack during the event, going from the front to rear. But I think in order to really understand what you're doing here, you almost got to start up front a little bit. So first to the points that you pointed at, then going back and looking at all the tied-in structures. So BMW notoriously on their previous generations took the steering rack like they have today, which is this assembly right here. They've structurally tied this into the subframe, and they've actually leveraged it as well as these SORB tusks to create a structural hoop. Then in addition to that, they brought skid plates down below, so tying this in from a stiffness perspective as well. Then moving rearward, what we saw is, if you look, it's going to be hard to make out, but the way that this cradle is attaching to the rail, they're creating yet another structural hoop that the half shaft is actually passing through. So similar to what folks have done with large castings, i.e. Model S, and getting a structural hoop for the half shafts to go through. So as you're kind of working your way back, the story that's being told here is a very stiff upper and lower load path as you go rearward. And so as it relates to getting back to this ramp, there's a lot of stiffness and structure leading up to this. And so looking at this, it's very difficult to say without kind of observing some of those impact events and watching some of the reactions structurally speaking. But regardless of if the subframe moves up relative to the battery pack or the battery pack moves down relative to it or something of that nature, at the end of the day, I believe that these ramps are to get these out of one another's collision paths. I think if I had to bet, the way that they're set up, I suspect that they're actually wanting this to help push this whole thing down and get out of the way of the battery pack. A counter theory to that in terms of going up, I would say they do have a fair bit of space, both fore, aft, and in the Z direction over the top of the pack. So I actually think, and this is not typically the case, there may be two viable paths as far as direction here. But, and the reason why I say it's not often is typically right up here in this area in the torque box zone, you're running right into body structure. So there's not always the opportunity for, I'll say, free crush space or travel space for these monuments to go to. But one thing's for sure, they have a lot of extrusions here, and there's just a lot going on in terms of this whole interface. So tying the battery in to the subframe and so forth.
Yeah, and if you can actually probably see it a little bit better from your view right here. If you take a peek in to kind of what Jordan was speaking to, like right here, we have like a double shear bracket that's running across kind of the upper cradle that I referred to before. It looks like it's a stamped aluminum piece, but again, BMW loves doing this, bracing, tying across various, major monuments to increase, how those parts are tied in together and increase overall rigidity for pretty much anything chassis related. So it's kind of exactly what I expected to see. So as we kind of move rearward in the vehicle, we talked a little bit before about the battery. So it's hard to see for sure if this is originally a stamped lower. It could be, I think just a large initial stamping. But you can see here through the friction stir welding that they're going essentially any cross-car structure within the battery pack itself, which is 84 kilowatts, I believe, with this vehicle.
Just over, yep.
At least usable. I like the idea of it. We haven't had a chance to look in this battery pack, and if I'm being honest, I haven't even kind of deep dived it on the internet as well to see maybe how their overall architecture is laid out. But there's no fasteners really running through anything to keep the overall pack itself together, which is kind of interesting. They are using all just the welding operations throughout the entire vehicle itself. So a lot of time there and frankly, relatively expensive cells as well, as far as manufacturing is concerned.
Yeah, but it's good, clean execution, very planar, right? Not a lot of opportunity for drag. The friction stir welding is not going to leave you exposed per se in terms of water egress points and so forth. And typically it's a pretty repeatable process as far as welding is concerned.
Yeah, and as you kind of come rearward, in the vehicle itself, if I could have you kind of look up and over the battery pack here, kind of where its penthouse is. So you'll see, your typical body structure, stampings, small cast nodes with self-piercing rivets. and you can see the difference in the colors there, and just kind of gives you some insight into the assembly sequence itself. But, you know, BMW and a lot of their larger, more expensive vehicles have been doing, you know, zonal or nodal castings, excuse me, for some time now, you know. So an interesting approach to getting the integration that we like to see, more specifically while keeping press tonnage and overall burden down as far as, you know, capital investment's concerned.
Yeah,
Jordan, you look like you're seeing a ghost.
No, I'm just
a relic from your past, your 550.
Oddly enough, in this vehicle, I can actually see over the top of the battery pack. But yeah, I'm not as vertically gifted as others. But looking at the top here, you see that black bell-like feature right there? Yeah, that's stamping. It's kind of an interesting feature. So one of the things that we need to be concerned about when looking at battery packs, and this is fundamental to the design of pretty much any high voltage battery pack, is thermal propagation, pressure mitigation, like figuring out ways for if there's an overtemp, you know, event with one of these battery packs, there's a space for the gas, the associated gas, to escape. Well, in this case, they're being quite, it looks like, right, and I'm only being able to see it from the outside looking in here, but it looks like that's a bell to divert those exhaust gases to come out of the battery pack to get them away from that occupant home and divert them downward. Almost looks like the thruster coming off the side of a rocket, right?
Absolutely.
And I would say, as far as like managing those gases and thermal mitigation events, that's about one of the most, has to be one of the most deliberate attempts at doing that I've seen thus far, right? So they're actively spending cash, they're adding weight to the vehicle, adding assembly to the vehicle, all with the intent to get that down, out, away from the cabin. I don't know, honestly, if they've got others around the vehicle, but one of their strategies could be conversely to like a Tesla, for example, where you've got those vents throughout the pack, down the sides, right, as you run fore aft. If they just have one for the whole pack, it's a strategy. You only have to deal with one.
There's actually another one on this side as well.
Oh, I don't, okay, so I don't know if you could see another one. But if there's only, let's say, 2 to Teslas, you know, over a dozen, for example, maybe they're like, you know, that's a strategy. We're going to dump it all in one spot. We're going to get it out of that battery pack.
Yeah, and it's another thing that's interesting is, you know, we spoke to essentially the whole leading edge of the battery being a series of extrude weldments. And then as you can see here in the back, where we transition from an extrusion that's cut right into a small casting for this edge here, where they're essentially, again, a series of double shear brackets from the battery going up to the cradle here itself. So, you know, again, I can't stress, you can really see it here. Cast cradle, isolator, and this stamped steel stanchion. Then we've got a, is this aluminum? I think it's just galvanized steel. That is providing a double shear aspect to that. And then we have another series of braces that are piggybacking off the rear torque box, picking up on this point here, and then running across and behind the cradle, and then picking up on the body side behind. So they absolutely love tying this up. Typically, we see structure on this on convertibles, you know, vehicles that we lose a lot of our roof structure that need additional body structure to help with vehicle dynamics. BMW does this just, you know, essentially from the get-go to get the dynamics that they like to see.
And I really, you know, when looking at this, you might be like, well, that's just extra cost, it's just extra weight, and so on and so forth. I would say yes, but you know, there's a lot to be said for the fact that BMW as a brand has truly distinguished themselves from a driving characteristics perspective, right? When you've got all of these OEMs doing gigacastings and doing all sorts of kind of wild stuff as far as structures are concerned, there's something to be said for a company that is still willing to put, you know, and granted, the price points of the vehicles allow for some of this, no doubt, but there's something to be said for the outright engineering that is going into some of their products, allowing the driving dynamics and characteristics of the vehicle to be so much superior in some respects, to the extent that the customer base is, you know, acknowledging that and, you know, sourcing or purchasing vehicles from them as a result.
Yeah, it's interesting. One thing I love about the rear cradle assembly itself is essentially this aspect here. So this is supporting the rear steer of this vehicle. What we're seeing here typically, I mean, this looks very similar to anything we've ever seen in essentially any Audi, Volvo, or BMW. I can't see it right now, but more than likely it's a ZF unit. And it's relatively conventional for what we typically have seen for rear steer units. But you can kind of see here, Eric, this extrusion here. It has almost every forming process that you can kind of come up with, and it's a very German execution of this particular part, and they love doing this, right? So they'll extrude it, they'll machine a whole series of things off, so all of their mounting tabs are integrated based off these machined edges here, and then we have a secondary. I don't know if it's necessarily a bending or a stamping operation. I almost want to say it's more of a bending operation to get the sweep that they need for this extrusion, and then they weld it to the casting itself. And then this particular cradle is actually split fore and aft, where the front side we essentially had two hemispheres. If you want to come over here and take a look up this way, Eric, right where the half shaft is, you can see their welded joint between the two halves, fore and aft, of this casting. So one of the things that Jordan and I've been kind of seeing with some of our customers is there's a lot of interest in castings in general, whether people are trying to fall in line with some of the mega or giga castings. And because of that, the supply base itself is not unlimited, right? You see a lot of what we see with some of these vehicles is simply just a trade-off, right? Like, why would we do this? We might feel strongly one way or another that it's something that is efficient or not efficient, but frankly, it really comes down to sometimes capital investment, what is available, press tonnage, what's there, what's not, what's in your market where this is being built, and life of the vehicle, all those things. So there's a lot of variables there, but I think it's interesting that given the style of casting they use and its size, that they decided to bring them together and weld it versus doing essentially two halves. Something drove them, whether it's the shape of the cradle, getting up and around, and how they're mounting their drive module in the rear. But there was a conflict, and then they essentially did it by splitting the casting in half and bringing it together and welding it. So.
Yeah, there's quite a bit going on back here. It's interesting, although I would say that they're in the forefront as far as structural engineering and really finding creative ways to tie things together structurally. Eric, if you zoom in here for a minute, kind of makes you smile sometimes in looking at things like this, which is a mass damper on the rear cradle. So as much engineering and analysis, I'm sure, went into a vehicle like this. Even those that I would say are definitely quite good at doing stuff like this, typically speaking. Yeah, you have to make accommodations, right? Life's a series of compromises, and that's especially true in the engineering space. So, I think overall, I'm always excited to get underneath and look at what BMW is coming out with. There's a lot going on, but with that is a fair bit of cost and weight as well, right? It's not necessarily a light vehicle in the grand scheme of things.
And what's interesting is, the rear suspension here, steel, so inexpensive stamping, but you can see racetrack edges all around. So while they are using a relatively inexpensive material, they have paid attention to trying to get as much weight as they can out of some of these, their components as well, to keep unsprung mass to a minimum. And, kind of as we move rearward, we saw a little bit with the front as far as air management, but we have the aero flickers that's removed on this side, but essentially nice flat battery. They're maintaining airflow. This entire underside is flat. They are managing airflow underneath the control arms, and then you can see the ducts coming out and rearward to clean the air as it leaves the vehicle as well. With some, they're not faux diffusers, but performance styling as well. So
the only other comment that I would make in looking at this, and maybe it's regional specific, likely is so, right? There's different requirements depending on where you're at. This clearly, especially since it's not on the other side, or not evident on the other side, it's not just a drain hole. Like, I would say these are like the drain holes, but this is probably where the pedestrian speaker would be attached to, but there's not one present here, right? There's a lot of folks are trying to figure out, can we just go to 1? Can we just go to 2? There's exterior decibel and frequency range requirements, right, from a regulatory perspective. And so looking at this, right, it tells me that certainly for this region, right, they're like, we don't need it, so they're not going to put the costs in the vehicle. So they're managing some complexity regionally speaking. But it does look like they're carrying a common part back here to accommodate both of those pedestrian speakers.
Yeah, so overall, I think we've hit kind of the high points with respect to the vehicle itself. So very, very similar to the i7. So you can take a look at that video and draw some contrasting, thoughts from Armin and myself with that one. But Jordan, do you want to add anything else?
No, I think you covered most of it. I'm glad to see another one on the Hoist, and I'm excited to go and take it for a drive.
Yeah, no, awesome. So then again, thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and we appreciate it. So thanks.
Thanks.